On November 1st, 1610, in the city of Logroño, Spain, 6 people were burned alive at the stake. The crowd that came to watch was large. Also at the auto da fe, the Spanish Inquisition's public ceremony of faith and punishment, were 5 effigies of other condemned people. Those 5 had already died in prison before the Inquisition could get to them. The institution burned the dolls anyway. This was, by the standards of the era, considered a proportionate response. The 6 people executed that day were among approximately 7,000 accused during the Basque Witch Trials of 1609 to 1614. 7,000. In a region where 1,000 people in a single village was a substantial settlement. In terms of raw case numbers, this was the largest single witch hunt investigation in European history. And at the end of it, 5 years of investigation, inquisitors riding through the Basque countryside, accusations piling on accusations, confessions extracted from people who had every incentive to name names, because naming names was the one thing that might keep you off the list for execution. 6 people were dead. Here is the question the story opens with. Why did it start? And why, once it started, did it produce so few executions relative to the scale of its machinery? The first answer involves a village, a monastery, and a meeting that happened 30 years before the first arrest. The second answer involves, of all things, an inquisitor who went in expecting to find witches and came out skeptical. But before we get to the mechanics, we have to get to the place. Zugarramurdi is a small village in the mountains of Navarre, in the Basque country, near the French border. In 1609, it had a population that could be counted in hundreds. It also had a cave, a large, impressive limestone cave called the Cuvas de Zugarramurdi, which local tradition had long associated with witches' Sabbaths, with the gathering of night flyers, with the whole apparatus of folk belief about what happened in dark places when respectable people were asleep. The cave was real, the Sabbaths were not. But the legend was old enough and vivid enough that, when an inquisitor arrived in the region looking for evidence of witchcraft, Zugarramurdi was precisely the kind of place the legend pointed toward. The inquisitor was Val Alvarado. He arrived in 1609, and the village of Zugarramurdi did not cover itself in glory in terms of what it told him. In the particular social dynamics of a small community under institutional pressure, accusations flow along existing fault lines. People accused the people they already disliked. People named the people who had wronged them in arguments about property or inheritance or precedence. People who had been named saved themselves, or tried to, by naming others. Val Alvarado arrested Maria de Arburu and Graciana Xarra in 1609. They were charged with witchcraft and participation in the witches' Sabbath at Zugarramurdi at the cave. That is, the landmark that local folklore had been narrating for generations as a site of demonic assembly. Let's talk about these 2 women, because they are not abstractions. Graciana Xarra, before her arrest, was the director of the local pilgrims' hospital. A hospital for pilgrims. In the early 17th century, running a hospital for travelers coordinating the care of the sick, the injured, the exhausted people moving through the mountain passes was skilled administrative work. Graciana Xarra had done it. She had held the position. She had managed the institution. And then she was accused of attending a witch's Sabbath in a cave, and Val Alvarado arrested her. And on November 1st, 1610, she was burned alive in Logroño in front of a large crowd. Maria de Arburu faced a slightly different framing of her alleged offense. She was accused of having succeeded Graciana de Barrenechea as the Queen of Aquelarre, the title given, in the inquisitorial construction of what a witch's Sabbath actually was, to the woman who presided over it. Aquelarre in Basque means the field of the male goat, a reference to the figure of the devil, imagined in folk tradition and inquisitorial theology alike as presiding over demonic gatherings in the form of a goat. The Queen of Aquelarre, in the Inquisition's imagination, was the human leader of a satanic organization that had been meeting regularly in a limestone cave outside a small Navarrese village. What Aquelarre actually appears to have been, in the lived reality of Zugarramurdi, was something far more ordinary, a local gathering space, associated in folk memory with communal traditions that the church had periodically tried to suppress, in a region where pre-Christian folk practices had never been fully extinguished and had simply gone semi-underground rather than disappearing. The Inquisition looked at a cave with a history and saw a satanic hierarchy. It then constructed a prosecution around that hierarchy, naming a queen, naming her predecessor, naming her subordinates, building an organizational chart of diabolic governance out of a mountain cave, and the accumulated accusations of frightened villagers. Now, the 30-year-old meeting. 30 years before the trials, approximately 1579, give or take the Arburu and Martina families of Zugarramurdi attended or organized a meeting that resulted in the village gaining greater independence from the nearby monastery. The monastery had authority over the village in a number of administrative and financial ways, as monasteries in this era frequently did over the communities within their sphere of influence, controlling certain revenues, certain legal jurisdictions, certain aspects of daily life that the village might reasonably prefer to control itself. The meeting in 1579 produced an outcome that reduced that control. The monastery did not forget. When the inquisitorial machinery arrived in 1609, scholars Mikkel Azarmendi and Emma Wilby have observed something that requires a moment to fully absorb: the overlap between the families who had challenged the monastery in that 1579 meeting and the families pursued for witchcraft charges was almost complete, almost entire overlap. This is not a coincidence. This is not the accidental convergence of two independent social processes producing the same list of names. Scholars have speculated with the weight of the evidentiary overlap behind the speculation that the enthusiasm to hunt witches in Zugarramurdi was principally revenge. A monastery had spent 30 years remembering a meeting in which it lost some of its authority. When an inquisitor came looking for witches, someone the abbot commissioner, the institutional memory of the monastery, whoever held the particular grudge that 30 years had sharpened, rather than dulled, pointed at the families who had been responsible. This is, in the broadest possible terms, how witch hunts work. The supernatural framework, the Sabbath, the Queen of Aquelarre, the cave, the goat-footed devil is the vehicle. The payload is something older and more local: a land dispute, a family rivalry, a creditor who has not been repaid, a neighbor whose land you want, an institution whose authority was successfully challenged 3 decades ago and has been filing the paperwork for revenge ever since. The vehicle in 1609 Basque Country was state-of-the-art. The Spanish Inquisition had refined the machinery of accusation and confession over a century and a quarter into something of genuine procedural sophistication. Accusations were taken seriously and investigated formally. The accused were brought before tribunals with jurisdiction over life and death. Confessions were extracted through methods that ranged from extended imprisonment and interrogation to more physical forms of persuasion, depending on the inquisitor and the perceived severity of the case. And critically, in the logic of the witch trial, confession was not merely accepted as evidence, it was also expected to produce names. Who else was at the Sabbath? Who else did you see in the cave? The accused, understanding that naming names might reduce their own sentence, named names. 7,000 names eventually. This is the number that makes the Basque Witch Trials singular in European history. Not the execution's 6 dead is, by the grotesque mathematics of early modern European witch hunts, actually a low number. Some smaller regional panics produced higher execution counts. The Basque trials were not distinguished by their body count. They were distinguished by their scale of investigation. 7,000 cases examined by the Inquisition over 5 years, in a region where the total population of the affected area was probably not much more than that. At some point during those 5 years, something unusual happened. The Inquisition stopped. Not in the sense of abandoning the project. Trials continued, investigations continued, the machinery kept running. But an internal skepticism developed, and it developed in the form of Alonso de Salazar Frías, an inquisitor sent by the Supreme Council of the Spanish Inquisition to review the situation in Basque Country after the 1,610 executions. Salazar, who would later be described by historians as one of the most empirically rigorous figures produced by the entire inquisitorial system, went into the region expecting to find evidence of mass witchcraft. He interviewed thousands of people. He examined the physical evidence. He looked at the alleged Sabbath sites. He found nothing. Or rather, he found the ordinary human material of accusation, fear, revenge, social pressure, the compulsive logic of a naming game that had been going for 5 years with no natural terminus. And he found no physical evidence that witchcraft, as the Inquisition understood it, had actually occurred. His report to the Supreme Council is one of the more remarkable documents produced by an institution not historically celebrated for its skepticism, a systematic dismantling of the evidentiary basis of thousands of witch accusations, concluding that the whole apparatus had been running on air and old grudges. The Supreme Council listened. New guidelines were issued instructing inquisitors to be more rigorous about physical evidence and more skeptical about confession-based accusations in witchcraft cases. The Basque Witch Trials wound down. No further executions followed after 1,610. The 6 people who had already been burned could not benefit from this institutional reconsideration. Let's say their names again, because the story tends to summarize them as a unit, and they were not a unit. They were 6 people: Domingo de Subeldegui, Maria de Echechute, Maria Bastin de Borda, Maria de Arburu, Graciana Xarra, Petri de Jongorna. 6 people from the Basque Country who had been alive in 1608 and were dead by November 2nd, 1610, because the Spanish Inquisition had arrived in their region with a mandate, and their neighbors had provided names, and a 30-year-old monastery dispute had finally found its instrument. And 5 effigies, because 5 of the condemned had died in prison before they could be brought to the stake, and the Inquisition, having gone to the trouble of convicting them in absentia and constructing the legal architecture of their condemnation, was not going to let a detail like their prior death prevent the public demonstration of institutional authority. So they burned the effigies on the same day in front of the same crowd. The crowd was large. The French side of the story runs parallel and is worth a moment's attention because the Basque Witch Trials did not emerge from nothing. Across the border, in the labored region of French Basque Country, a magistrate named Pierre de Lancre had been conducting one of the most prolific and publicly theatrical witch-hunting campaigns of the era. De Lancre was a man of strong opinions, extensive documentation, and no apparent doubts about the reality of what he was prosecuting. His written accounts of the Sabbaths described in lurid detail by the people he interrogated the feasting, the dancing, the sexual encounters with demons, the elaborate hierarchies of hell were published and read across Catholic Europe. De Lancre's campaign in Labourd directly influenced the outbreak in Spanish Basque Country. Not just atmospherically, the idea of witchcraft spreading across borders was itself a feature of the inquisitorial worldview, but practically. Some of the accusations and confessions on the Spanish side referenced activities and individuals from the French side, as if the demonic organization being described operated as a cross-border entity that did not respect the Pyrenees. Lancre's work had created a vocabulary of witchcraft accusation that was available for import, and the Spanish Inquisition imported it. The cross-contamination of persecution is one of the more underappreciated mechanisms of the witch trial era. When one jurisdiction begins executing people for witchcraft, neighboring jurisdictions face institutional pressure to demonstrate equivalent vigilance. To not respond to an outbreak of suspected witchcraft visible just across the border was to imply that the local authorities were either incompetent or insufficiently concerned about diabolism, neither of which was a comfortable position for any institution dependent on its reputation for protecting Christian communities from supernatural threat. The French panic functioned as a signal to Spanish ecclesiastical authorities. Look what is happening over there. Look what is presumably happening over here. The village of Zugarramurdi, with its cave and its legend and its 30-year-old unresolved property dispute, was waiting in exactly the right place when that signal arrived. Now let's look at what the system produced, because the arithmetic of the Basque Witch Trials is itself a kind of argument. 7,000 investigated, 6 executed. 5 years of inquisitorial activity, an entire regional apparatus of accusation and counteraccusation, and confession and retraction. Thousands of interviews conducted by a man who ultimately told the Supreme Council that the entire enterprise had been built on nothing, and the output was 6 deaths and a policy change. The 6 deaths are not minimized by the policy change that followed them. But the policy change is worth understanding because it is genuinely unusual in the history of institutions that have developed momentum in a particular direction. The Spanish Inquisition, confronted with evidence through its own internal review process that mass witch hunting was producing convictions based on coerced confessions rather than evidence, adjusted its guidelines. It did not stop believing in witchcraft. It stopped believing that the specific accusations being generated in the Basque country reflected actual witchcraft, and it issued instructions to make future prosecutions harder to sustain on the basis of accusation alone. This is a specific kind of institutional self-correction, not a repudiation of the system's premises, but a recalibration of its evidentiary standards. And it worked. In the narrow sense that the Basque Witch Trials ended, no one else was executed, and the 7,000 accused were left to reconstruct their lives in communities where they had spent years being regarded as servants of the devil. What that reconstruction looked like, what it meant to have been one of the 6,994 people investigated, but not executed, in a village where your neighbors had named you, where the accusation itself had marked you regardless of its outcome, the historical record does not dwell on extensively. The monastery is still there. Zugarramurdi is still there, a small village in the Navarrese mountains, now famous primarily for its cave and for its role in the 1609 witch trials, which are commemorated with a museum and have become a point of cultural heritage tourism in the region. The cave where the Sabbaths were supposedly held is now a visitor attraction. You can walk through it, there are signs. The families who challenged the monastery in 1579 are remembered, if at all, as witches. The monastery's role in pointing the Inquisition at those families is noted by scholars and largely absent from popular memory. History has a way of remembering the accusation more vividly than the motive behind it. The 6 names on the execution record remain: Domingo de Subeldegui, Maria de Echechute, Maria Bastin de Borda, Maria de Arburu, Graciana Xarra, Petri de Jongorna. One of them ran a hospital. One of them was accused of being the queen of a demonic assembly in a cave. All of them, in the most material sense, lost a fight they never knew they were in, a fight that had started 30 years before they were arrested, in a meeting about monastery revenues and village autonomy, conducted by their families and remembered by their enemies. The auto-da-fe of November 1st, 1610 was attended by a large crowd. They burned 6 people and 5 effigies. The crowd went home. The monastery got to keep some of what it had lost. 7,000 accused. 6 dead. 5 effigies for the ones the prison got first. And 1 meeting 30 years earlier that a monastery never forgave. The largest witch hunt investigation in European history was a property dispute with better branding.